Today we will talk about objects and variables. Yes, so today we're going to talk about objects and variables in C++. We're going to discuss the lesson brought to us by learncpp.com. So if you haven't already, go over there, read lesson 1.3, and then return back here. Make sure you turn off your ad blocker to give them the love they deserve. And just a quick disclaimer, I'm not an expert at C++. This is just a commentary to add my 2 cents and learn more about C++ myself. So with that, let's get started. I'll change my display. Okay, so introduction to objects and variables. All right, so in the last lessons, we talked about statements, functions, and comments. We know that statements are instructions within a program, and functions are groupings of these statements. And these statements execute sequentially from top to bottom in a program. But how do programs actually produce results? Well, they do it through data or information. They can either read the information directly, they can change it and manipulate it in essentially any way you can think of, and they can write to that data. So they can add information into the program. So here's another definition of a program. A program is a collection of instructions that can manipulate data to produce a desired result. It can acquire this data in several ways. You can use a file, so you can use a text file, you can use a PNG for an image, or you're on YouTube right now, you can get data from a database over a network. So YouTube stores the data of this video in some database and it sends it to your computer over a network. Another way to get this data is just directly inputting it into your computer while your program is running. And we'll see that today. And like we said before, programs can then manipulate this data and send it to your monitor to be displayed. And the format of this data is usually not human readable when the program is actually using it. So in the last lesson, we talked about the Hello World program. The computer's not really reading Hello World directly. From the computer's point of view, it's just seeing ones and zeros, right? So it has to convert this type into binary, which we'll talk about later. Now, a single piece of data in C++ is just called a value. Values can be numbers, they can be letters or characters. So they can be a lot of different things. But a value is just one piece of data. Okay, so they have this quick snippet of random access memory, or RAM. What RAM is basically the operating system gives you a portion of memory. It allocates memory for your program. So it gives your program access to a section of memory in your computer that it can use to store the data that it's reading, manipulating, or writing to. So you can think of RAM, here's a good analogy, you can think of RAM as a series of numbered boxes. So have you ever been to a post office and seen those P.O. boxes where you can put letters into? It's kind of like that. Older languages like BASIC was, I think they still use it in like banking applications. But you could directly access these boxes. For instance, you could have a statement in your program that says, go get the value stored in mailbox number 7532. You could see that it'd be hard to write a program around this because you have to be so specific on where you want to put a piece of information or read a piece of information from. So that's kind of difficult. So C and C++ came around, and essentially they gave you a what is called an object. So the object is essentially a region of storage that stores a value. But that's it, right? So that differs from what we had up here where you just had a mailbox number 7532. So instead of that, we're going to have a object that represents that mailbox. Okay, so yeah, so go get that value stored by this object. So it just simplifies or abstracts away having to know which exact mailbox we're looking for. Instead, we can just have the mailbox have a more human readable name. Objects can be anonymous, but more often than not, they have a name, and we call that a variable. An object is used to store a value in memory, right? A variable is an object that has a name or identifier we talked about last lesson. In naming our objects, so this helps us because we can use them later in the program. Yeah, and this important distinction excludes functions. So functions are not objects in C++. In other languages they are, but not in C++. Okay, variable instantiation. We'll talk about instantiation more in the next lesson, but here's just kind of a brief overview of it. So in order to create this variable, right, so again, a variable is an object given a name or identifier. We use a special kind of declaration statement called a definition. But here's basically the simplest example, essentially, that you can have of a variable. So this is the variable, x, right? Just like in any math class. And note this is a complete statement right here. We have a semicolon. So this is a declaration statement. And we're given a type int, so an integer. So when the compiler sees this statement, it makes note that we are defining a variable, x. And it remembers this, right? It remembers x, it remembers integer, so that when we use it later in a program, it knows the context in which it's using the variable. So during runtime, the variable will be instantiated. So we run our program and a variable is instantiated. So an instance of that variable is created. So the object is created and assigned a memory address. This is called an instance. Okay, so data types we'll cover in a lot more detail. This is just a brief overview here. But a data type determines what kind of value the object will store. So back up here, this x variable stores a integer number. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, all the way up to a certain amount. I forgot what the extent of the integer type is. But these are integers. They can also be negative values. But yeah, that's essentially what a data type is. And data types for variables must be known at compile time. What this means is before the program starts running, before you execute your program, it needs to know the data type of every variable you're using. The data type of an object must be known at compile time. So just remember that. So we'll talk about a double type. Basically, a short explanation is it's a decimal number, a number with a decimal. You can also create your own custom types in C++, which is very helpful and we'll talk about. Yeah, and then this is like if you want to define multiple variables, usually the best practice is to just, for each line, define a variable. Just stick with that. You can use a comma. If it's the same type here, you can use a comma and have a multiple variables instantiated on the same line, but this is generally not recommended. So here, just remember you list the type once. If you do it twice, you'll get a compiler error. And don't use a semicolon. It's a comma if you're going to use it. Okay, but best practice is to do one variable per line, and that's what this says here. Okay, and that's essentially objects and variables. So objects are just regions of memory, and variables are objects with a identifier so that we can use it later in time. And they have an identifier, a name, a type, and a value. A value is just a piece of information. A type is what that value represents. So now we'll go over to the right here and just go through this practice problem. Don't worry if you don't have a science background. This problem is about pH. So we're going to try to find the pH of applesauce that has a hydrogen concentration of 0.0003 moles per liter. So here's a double. Here's a variable that has a type double. So right here, this is a double. This has a decimal place, right? Decimal places, right? So we instantiate this when we start our program. So we have a pH, and we haven't assigned it a value yet. So we'll see next lesson that you can actually assign it when you instantiate. And there's different ways to do this. But like, if you want a neutral pH of 7, you can instantiate it at the time your program starts. But right now we won't do that. Okay, so here's another variable. So this is the identifier. This is the data type. And we don't have any value or data assigned to it right now. So these are just empty regions of memory right now. But this is an object and this is an object. Essentially, this is where we're going to talk to our program. So like I said earlier, we can input data through the console. So when we run this program, we'll be able to input the hydrogen ion concentration. Okay, and then for this program, what this does is it will call this pH function right here, calculate pH, and we're going to pass in the hydrogen ion concentration as a parameter. Let's go up to this function. So we have this function I wrote here. It's called calculate pH. It takes in an argument of H concentration. Again, here we have another object in this function scope, which we'll talk about scope later in detail. But just know that this is another object different from this one because it's in a different function. And then here, don't worry about the math here, but we just calculate the pH, and then we return the pH from this function as a double, type double, back to this function. And then this variable, this pH, which we already instantiated, we already created this variable, we're going to use it later in this program right here. And this value, remember it's returning a double, now is assigned, so this turns into essentially a decimal like that, and then assigns this value that returned to this variable that we set up here, pH. And then this last line, like we discussed, this just prints applesauce pH, and then it'll print our value pH. It'll print this to the console, and then we'll return our program. Okay, so let's go ahead and just run this program. So I'm going to click up this arrow right here. We'll build our program. So we're building, build succeeded. And then here we go. So our program is running in the console here. It says enter concentration. So right now our program has already ran through these lines, and we're on this line right here, line 25. And it's stopped because of this, which we'll learn about later. But this is basically this is a operator to allow us to input data into the program. So we need to enter the concentration. So we're already given the concentration up here, 0.0003. So we'll go ahead and just type that in. Oops. 0.03. And then we'll hit enter to continue the program. And it's going to take this number now. So we put this number in, it's going to take this number, and it's going to plug it into this function here. And then it's going to return us the pH of applesauce, hopefully. So we go there, and we see that the applesauce pH is 3.5 about. And then our program ended with exit code 0. So we know that our program ran successfully. And that's essentially it, right? So now I suggest you guys do the quiz. If you have any questions, let me know. Thanks for watching this video, and I hope you guys have a good day or good night. Peace.